April 13, 2026. The United States Navy sealed the Persian Gulf. Not gradually, not cautiously, completely. Over 10,000 personnel deployed across two carrier strike groups, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford, two of the most advanced naval platforms ever constructed, each representing over $30 billion in defensive capability and sustained operational reach. The USS Tripoli, a San Antonio-class amphibious transport dock, positioned to project power deep into the region. More than a dozen additional warships, including destroyers, frigates, and guided missile cruisers, each one a self-contained military system capable of commanding entire sectors of ocean. Over 100 aircraft, from advanced fighter jets to anti-ship missiles to long-range surveillance platforms, every component positioned with singular purpose, every asset deployed with singular intent. Nothing moves through the Strait of Hormuz without permission. Nothing moves through the Strait of Hormuz without permission. Nothing. CENTCOM declared the blockade fully implemented by April 15th. The timeline was precise. The operational posture was complete. Within the first 24 hours, 6 commercial vessels received the message and changed course entirely, their captains understanding immediately that the choice was simple: proceed no further or face consequences. Within 36 hours, 8 oil tankers were intercepted and diverted. 0 boardings required. Every captain understood the calculus. Every crew member grasped the reality. The blockade was not a threat. The blockade was not a proposal. The blockade was real. Military planners celebrated across the command structure. The operation functioned exactly as designed. A distant blockade, forces positioned in the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea, not crowding the strait itself in a way that would provoke escalation or create diplomatic complications. Economically devastating, militarily elegant. The architecture was sound. The execution appeared flawless. The Navy had achieved in days what strategic theorists had debated for years: the ability to stop the flow of global energy without direct conflict. CENTCOM made the official announcement on April 15th. No vessels breached the blockade. Not one. Not a single ship penetrated the perimeter. The lines held. But that statement ended on April 15th. Because the first rule of blockade enforcement is absolute. It is not a suggestion. It is not a principle that admits exceptions. It is not a guideline or a framework or a strategic approach that commanders can interpret based on circumstances. It is a law of warfare, proven across centuries of military history, tested by every naval power that ever attempted to strangle trade, tested by empires and nation-states and alliances. The rule exists because it has been proven again and again, in blood and treasure and broken nations. One ship gets through, the blockade dies. Everything that follows is merely the announcement of a corpse. The Chinese tanker MV Rich Starry carried approximately 250,000 barrels of methanol, a chemical feedstock critical for industrial production across multiple sectors: pharmaceuticals, plastics, fuel additives. Malawian flagged, a flag of convenience permitting vague ownership structures and complex liability arrangements. Chinese owned, part of the vast shipping networks that China has constructed to ensure no resource bottleneck can isolate its industrial base. Its transponder had been spoofed for 11 days. A signal deliberately masked, coordinates falsified, identity obscured, to hide movement through waters where every pixel of ocean is monitored by American satellites and radar stations and sensor networks. The ship crossed the strait. BBC Verified documented it with precision. Timestamps and satellite imagery and vessel tracking data all converging on a single conclusion: the tanker made transit. At least 4 additional Iran-linked vessels followed the same path in the subsequent hours and days, using the breach as proof of concept, as evidence that the blockade had become permeable. The blockade was already broken. This is not conjecture. This is not interpretation. This is not a matter of strategic debate or academic analysis. This is mathematics. The credibility of a blockade is singular. It does not exist on a spectrum. It does not have degrees or gradations. A blockade either holds or it fails. It is binary. It is absolute. There is no middle ground. There is no such thing as a blockade that is 99% effective. There is no such thing as a blockade that lets through only a few ships but remains strategically valid. Once the first breach occurs, the entire construct collapses. Look at the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. The blockade was already broken. This is not conjecture. This is not interpretation. This is not a matter of strategic debate or academic analysis. This is mathematics. The credibility of a blockade is singular. It does not exist on a spectrum. It does not have degrees or gradations. A blockade either holds or it fails. It is binary. It is absolute. There is no middle ground. There is no such thing as a blockade that is 99% effective. There is no such thing as a blockade that lets through only a few ships but remains strategically valid. Once the first breach occurs, the entire construct collapses. Look at the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. Iran's economy floats on seaborne trade, approximately 90% of it. The nation's entire industrial base, its ability to feed its population, its capacity to maintain government functions and military capabilities, depends on maritime commerce. At the moment CENTCOM announced full implementation of the blockade, Iran had 157.7 million barrels of petroleum on water. Barrels. Think about that number. More than 150 million individual units of the substance that powers global civilization, floating in tankers across the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, nearly all of it destined for China. Because China is now Iran's primary customer, China needs that crude. China is willing to pay prices that keep Iran afloat despite American sanctions. The blockade was supposed to stop the flow. The blockade was supposed to accumulate those barrels on water until they became unsaleable, economically stranded, forcing Iran into negotiation from a position of weakness. But it didn't, not completely, not even partially. The flow continued. This is why the first rule exists. It is not written in any military manual, but every commander knows it. It is not taught in official doctrine, but every strategist grasps it. It is encoded in the history of naval warfare itself, in the blood of sailors, in the lessons paid for in centuries of conflict. The Berlin blockade of 1948 stands as one of the most important tests of this rule. The Soviets, under Stalin, believed West Berlin would surrender within weeks, would starve into submission, would capitulate to Soviet pressure, and join the Eastern Bloc. But the Western powers, Britain, the United States, France, faced an absolute choice: either concede or maintain the blockade through alternative means. They chose the airlift. Every single day, American and British aircraft flew into West Berlin with supplies. Not a single day broke the commitment, not one day of relief from the effort. The airlift required constant operations, constant logistical pressure, constant expenditure of fuel and maintenance and pilot hours. It was not efficient, but it was unbroken. The blockade held because the Allies never let a single supply run fail. The Soviets could see that the commitment was absolute. Eventually, they ended the blockade. The Allies' willingness to sustain the airlift proved that they would not be forced to abandon Berlin. Consistency was the weapon. Unbreakable commitment was the strategy. The Union blockade during the American Civil War stands as perhaps the most consequential blockade in modern history. The North sought to strangle the South economically, to prevent the Confederacy from exporting cotton, its primary source of wealth, and from importing manufactured goods and munitions. It strangled the Confederacy, but only because it was enforced with absolute consistency. Every breach weakened the blockade's strategic effect. Every successful blockade runner, and there were hundreds, sleek, fast ships designed specifically to pierce the Union cordon, encouraged the next attempt. Blockade runners became more sophisticated. Routes became more complex. The cost of maintaining the blockade grew, but the North never wavered. The blockade held because the Union Navy maintained its presence despite casualties, despite diplomatic pressure from Britain and France, who wanted to break the blockade, despite the economic costs. Every breach was treated as a critical failure, requiring response and reinforcement, not as a minor exception to an overall successful strategy. That consistency, that refusal to accept the legitimacy of any successful penetration, is what eventually forced Southern surrender. Operation Earnest Will in 1987 and 1988 represented a more limited blockade, but one that illustrated the principle identically. The United States Navy was protecting Kuwaiti tankers in the Iran-Iraq War, a dangerous mission where Iranian Revolutionary Guard vessels, small but heavily armed, could attack commercial shipping. The Navy's presence alone was insufficient. The moment one ship came under attack without response, the entire operation's credibility evaporated. Every time Iranian forces engaged a Kuwaiti tanker, the Navy responded, sometimes with overwhelming force. Every attack was treated as a violation that demanded a military answer. Consistency was the weapon. The principle was immutable. If you let one attack succeed unopposed, then every subsequent attack becomes inevitable. The Navy maintained the operation for months, sustained the effort, absorbed the costs, and never allowed a single tactical breach. That consistency proved to Iran that the blockade was real, that penetrating it carried costs, that the United States would respond to every violation. The British blockade of Germany in World War I stands as perhaps the most economically devastating blockade in history. It was not the fastest method of warfare. It did not win battles or capture territory, but it was relentless. 4 years of strangling trade. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians died from malnutrition and disease resulting from the blockade. Food became scarce. Industrial production collapsed. The German war machine, starved of resources, eventually ground to a halt. But the blockade held because Britain never wavered. The Germans attempted to break it with U-boat commerce raiders, submarine vessels that sank merchant ships. But the British responded with convoy systems, with naval escorts, with systematic anti-submarine warfare. The blockade adapted, but never broke. The commitment never faltered. That consistency, that willingness to absorb the costs of maintaining the blockade year after year, is what eventually forced German surrender. The Brent crude oil price tells the story of the Persian Gulf blockade's true consequences. April 13th, 2026, $99.36 per barrel. The blockade announcement hit markets like a shock. Oil traders, processing the news that the world's most critical energy choke point was sealed, bid prices upward. What happens when allies complain about energy prices? When trading partners demand exemptions? When humanitarian pleas for medical supplies create pressure for exceptions? The moment commanders are told to stand down, to let humanitarian exemptions flow freely, to negotiate individual passages, to create special categories of acceptable traffic, the blockade is over. One ship becomes a precedent. One precedent becomes a justification for a second ship. 2 ships become a pattern. 3 ships become systematic failure. The mathematical certainty accelerates. Each ship that transits is proof that the blockade is permeable. Each additional breach is confirmation that the rule has been broken. The architects of this blockade understood the principle beforehand. They knew it before deployment. 2 destroyers transited the Strait of Hormuz on April 11th, deliberately, during peace talks, not randomly, not by accident. A message. A demonstration of capability. What happens when allies complain about energy prices, when trading partners demand exemptions, when humanitarian pleas for medical supplies create pressure for exceptions? The moment commanders are told to stand down, to let humanitarian exemptions flow freely, to negotiate individual passages, to create special categories of acceptable traffic, the blockade is over. One ship becomes a precedent. One precedent becomes a justification for a second ship. 2 ships become a pattern. 3 ships become systematic failure. The mathematical certainty accelerates. Each ship that transits is proof that the blockade is permeable. Each additional breach is confirmation that the rule has been broken. The architects of this blockade understood the principle beforehand. They knew it before deployment. 2 destroyers transited the Strait of Hormuz on April 11th, deliberately, during peace talks, not randomly, not by accident. A message. A demonstration of capability, a warning about what was coming, a signal to Iran and to every maritime actor on Earth that American power was about to be positioned and that movement through the strait was about to become impossible. But capability and execution are not the same thing. A blockade is not about force. It is not about the number of ships or the number of aircraft or the sophistication of weapon systems. It is about the credibility that force creates. It is about the believability of the threat. It is about the demonstrated willingness to enforce every crossing and accept every cost. One Chinese tanker, 250,000 barrels of methanol. Transponder spoofed, route calculated with precision, passage executed with skill. That ship did more damage to the blockade than any military outcome could have prevented. No military action, no naval engagement, no combat scenario could have inflicted the damage that a single successful transit achieved. Because every naval commander, every petroleum trader, every geopolitical actor, from Beijing to Moscow to Tehran to Tokyo to Seoul, received the same message that day. The blockade has a weakness. It can be penetrated. The perimeter is not actually sealed. The Navy cannot actually prevent all transit. The first rule is broken. And once the first rule is broken, enforcement becomes negotiation. The distinction is absolute. When a blockade is unbroken, commanders can issue orders with confidence. They can tell captains that passage is impossible. They can tell traders that oil cannot flow. But when the blockade is broken, when evidence exists of penetration, then every order becomes negotiable. Every restriction becomes subject to exception. Theater becomes liability. The blockade becomes a statement of intent that no longer carries the weight of reality. The Strait of Hormuz still separates Iran from the world. The warships are still there, the personnel still deployed, the aircraft still flying, the sensors still gathering data, the logistics still flowing, the cost still accumulating. But the blockade, in any meaningful sense, is already over. The economic effect is diminishing. The strategic impact is declining. The credibility is eroding. One ship. That is all it ever takes. That is all it has ever taken. Across every century of naval warfare, across every blockade attempted by every power from ancient times to the present day, the principle remains absolute and unchanging. If you let one ship through, you've already lost.